Yeah, recording in progress. Yeah, I better record as well. Record. Right. It's been a real change of mood in the working class in the last week, inspired by the action of railway workers standing up for their rights, and particularly standing up against cuts to jobs that would make the kind of risks that happened in Grenfell Tower become more prevalent on the railways as well. In other words, cutting costs in order to boost profits of private companies, and at the expense of sufficient safety measures that are required for people working on the railway and for the public. It's been a real inspiration to talk to railway pickets in Morpeth, Northumberland, who from the minute I first met them were talking about the need for a general strike to bring down the government, showing a really very, very good level of understanding of where we are and what this confrontation really leads towards. In the past, I've met strikers who have been preoccupied with quite understandably, preoccupied with the immediate issues, some kind of particular dispute over safety or wages with their employer. These strikers, of course, they've got particular issues. They've got stuff that affects them at work, but straight away seeing much broader implications of this particular confrontation between labour and capital. And that's the background to a new era which is opening up now, which we will review in this meeting this afternoon or this morning or this evening, depending upon which time zone you're in. We will be reviewing the situation in Britain with great excitement and expectation, and also a degree of responsibility, because as Marxists, we have a big part to play in helping this new movement develop. We have two speakers this afternoon. We have two speakers today. The first is Roger Silverman, who really is so well known in Wynn that I don't need to introduce him at all. And we're going over to Roger first. Roger, who's editor of On the Brink, over to you. He's going to speak for about 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you, comrades. Well, I think, as you say, there's a new mood sweeping Britain. The magnificent TUC march last week marked the re-entry of the working class back to the forefront of British history. A wave of protest has begun, with strikes of the railways, airport ground staff, soon communications workers, nurses, GPs, even barristers. Britain is ruled by a regime which drunkenly staggers from one hollow theatrical gesture to the next, getting Brexit done at punitive cost, tearing up the Northern Ireland Protocol, blocking all legal routes to asylum, deporting migrants to Rwanda, scrapping the Human Rights Act, and now preparing to smash a resurgent trade union resistance and tame the workforce. So an all-out class war is on the cards. There's legislation in the pipeline allowing the wholesale use of agency workers, scabs, to break strikes, something that even Thatcher had never dared. Johnson and his faction of the ruling class are consciously plotting an all-out confrontation. A general strike, as Ed said, is in the air, and it's a deliberate provocation, as in 1926. But it's also a fatal miscalculation, because then the ruling class could mobilize a mass strike-breaking force of jolly jingoistic volunteers to wave the flag and keep Britannia moving. Where will they find such an army now? Then they could recruit from a pool of professionals, middle class, and youth. Today, the so-called middle class, previously privileged strata, but now squeezed by the monopolies or driven into opposition, are now amongst the most militant strikers, and the youth are overwhelmingly in rebellion. where Johnson and company are desperately gambling on whipping up commuter resentment against the railmen, a clear 58% today, almost 2/3 of the population, support the RMT strike. The working class is regathering its forces. It may be diminished in industrial concentration, but it's regaining cohesion. Society is becoming not less, but more proletarianized. After all, which were the two biggest and longest national strikes in Britain in recent years? Those of the university lecturers and the hospital doctors. Both these workforces were previously quintessentially middle class. Now they're highly organized and highly combative. And teachers are among the best organized workers. So now GPs are threatening to strike. And at the other end of the spectrum too, new unions are springing up among what were previously a near enslaved underclass, the millions of casualized fast food workers, couriers, and office cleaners who now make up a majority of Britain's workforce. Yes, trade union membership has halved since the 1970s, but over the last 4 years, it has steadily grown by 400,000 to a total now of 6.6 million. And even before this new upsurge, trade union membership had risen by 120,000 in the last year. So where Thatcher thought she had exorcised the spectre of trade unionism, now it's beginning to haunt her successors. So such is the deeply ingrained class consciousness of the population over the generations. So what about the youth? In 1926, college kids were queuing up for the fun of rallying around the flag and driving buses and trucks. Can we imagine students today flocking to volunteer as scabs? If you take the opinion polls, almost incredibly among young people, 70% explicitly favour socialism. There was a surge in youth votes for Labour in 2017, and even in 2019, among 18 to 24-year-olds, Labour had a massive lead over the Tories of 43%. The right-wing institution, the Institute of Economic Affairs, says, and this is a direct quote, "Younger people really do quite consistently express hostility to capitalism and positive views of socialist alternatives. These attitudes," it says, "may be a preview of mainstream opinion in Britain tomorrow." All right, but isn't the working class weaker now with the decay of heavy industry? Let's see. A survey in 1983 found that 60% of the population classified themselves as working class. Of course, that was before Thatcher's shutdown of the mines and the collapse of most of heavy industry, car plants, steelworks, shipyards, etc. So at that time, 60% of the population said we're working class. And today, 40 years later, the figure is exactly the same. A majority of people, again, still 60%, identify as working class. Just under half of people in jobs classified as managerial and professional consider themselves working class. In other words, the proportion who consider themselves working class has not changed since 1983. So what about the collapse of the Labour vote in 2019 under Corbyn? That's another myth. Of course, true, it was a setback compared to 2017, which was Labour's best ever surge in votes, apart from in Scotland. But how do you measure a party's popularity? Surely by the number of people who vote for it. And by that measure, 2019 was actually Labour's second best result since 2001. Better than under Miliband, Brown, or even Blair in 2005 when Labour won. There has been a setback for the organised left, and I have to say, due mainly to the pusillanimity and confusion of its more prominent leaders. But this is just a temporary pause for regroupment. The attacks of the ruling class are now once again beginning to focus resistance. And that's because average real wages are falling at their fastest rate for over 20 years. The equivalent, it's been worked out, to a loss of £26 a week for the average worker. Even before the new crisis of stagflation and the cost of living crisis, it had been calculated that average household disposable incomes would have suffered a catastrophic drop of 42% over the 2 decades since the 2008 crash. The decline of Britain's production per person has meant a per capita loss of £6,700. Brexit has already cost an annual average increase of £870 in the cost of living, and it costs the average family another £472 per annum loss of income due to Britain's damaged competitiveness. Since the referendum also, gross domestic product per capita has fallen by 4%, while that of the EU has risen by 15%. Exports to the EU will have been cut by 38% by 2030, and in addition, there's a further 16% decline due to foregoing further integration. So as a result, record numbers of employed workers are claiming universal credit and using food banks. In London, the drop in pay per worker averages £750 per year. Average public sector pay is rising by 1.5%, while inflation is due to reach 11% very soon. So Johnson, who until recently was boasting of a predicted high wage, high productivity economy, is now warning against a wage price spiral. The pound is rapidly depreciating against the dollar and the euro, so far by 12%. Britain has the lowest predicted growth of all major economies except Russia, and that predicted growth is exactly 0%. But there are record job vacancies, 1.3 million. In 2020, there were 4 applicants per job vacancy, and now at best there's 1 per vacancy. And the combination of soaring inflation on the one hand and labour shortages on the other means just one thing: strikes. And that's why we're entering a new era of class struggle in Britain. Now, it's true, Britain is now one of the most deindustrialized countries in Europe. Its industrial production is now lower per capita than not only Germany and France, but the Czech Republic and Slovenia. Once the so-called workshop of the world, enjoying the rule of an empire on which the sun never sets, Britain is rapidly losing even its last remaining status as a global financial centre. It's a byword now for laundered cash, shoveled into property speculation, asset stripping, black money, parasitical and outright criminal activity. The symbol of British capitalism today is no longer the shipyards and the steel foundries, nor even the stock exchange of the City of London, but the tower blocks of empty luxury flats built solely as depositories of the world's black money, mocking the homeless who are sleeping in their shadow on the streets. Along with Britain's decay, a new faction has displaced the old establishment. Over the centuries since the end of the English Civil War, behind a permanent royal facade, political power had shifted from the aristocracy to industry to finance. But Johnson ruthlessly squashed the remnants of the old patrician establishment, the captains of industry and the banks. The party which ruled England for 350 years has now fallen into the clutches of a bunch of property speculators and hedge fund managers. And this explains the spasms currently convulsing the Tory party. Following the collapse of the British Empire came the disintegration of the United Kingdom itself. It's just one referendum away from losing Scotland. And with Sinn Féin likely soon to prevail in Ireland, both north and south, before long, Northern Ireland can be expected over time to conclude some kind of accommodation, if not a straight reunification deal with the Irish Republic. So Great Britain, so-called, could soon no longer exist, let alone constitute a united kingdom. Instead, just England and perhaps Wales would remain, leaving it an offshore island off the European mainland, a tourist spot for sightseers visiting quaint ancient relics like the Tower of London and Shakespeare's birthplace, and perhaps also taking in the whiskey stills of its neighbouring country, Scotland, in a double bill. And the story is symbolised in the scandals of the monarchy. These are not a trivial diversionary soap opera. They foreshadow the demise of the dynasty itself. Where the current sovereign is still maybe held in some last lingering reverence, once her reign comes to an end, its surviving members, the unforgiven Charles and Camilla, the disgraced Andrew, the already abdicated Harry, etc., will hold no such charisma. So I'd just like to finish on this point. There's a brilliant history of the years preceding the First World War called The Strange Death of Liberal England. The ruling party today, the Tory party, is the new face of UKIP and the Brexit party. They have split the oldest and most stable political party in Europe to bring about what we might call the strange death of conservative England. But today we're witnessing actually the strange death of both the two main parties, both of them facing existential crises. The Labour Party is in the throes of a historic and long overdue split, inflicted with ruthless determination by one side and throwing the other, temporarily I hope, into a state of confusion with unremitting pressure building up for a delayed explosion. It's up to now, yes, a one-sided split, but nonetheless systematic and deadly for all that. The left are being ruthlessly and systematically driven out. Starmer, it's quite clear, has already concluded a secret pact with the Lib Dems, as we see from these recent by-elections. In Tiverton, which was where Labour deliberately did no campaigning and left it to the Lib Democrats. In Tiverton, in the 2019 election, Labour had come second, but it stood aside in the by-election. That's obviously because of a quite explicit deal conducted in secret, of course, clandestinely with the Lib Dems. And I think that the next election almost inevitably will bring to power some kind of Lib-Lab coalition, and very probably soon after that, a direct merger. And that will give a gigantic impetus towards a new mass socialist party based on a revived and militant campaigning trade union movement. Inevitably, irrevocably, a new explosion of resistance and revolution is coming. Still today, nothing moves without the consent of the working class. And today, the workers are teaching the Tories that lesson. So thank you, comrades.
Thank you very much, Roger, for a very rousing as well as precise and scientific introduction to this discussion. I'm now going straight over to Steve McKenzie. Steve is a veteran of the trade union movement, former Broad Left National Secretary of the Public Employers Union, currently a member of Unite Community. I'm going over to Steve to hear some more on what's developing industrially. Over to you, Steve.
Oh, thank you very much, Ed, and thank you, Roger. Very good uplifting speech. I don't think that I'm going to be as uplifting as Roger, because I'm going to also raise one of the problems that we've got confronting us, because I believe as Marxists it's a responsibility to recognise what the reality of the situation is, because only by doing that can we assess what the problems are that are facing us and work out how we're going to overcome them. Now, the question before us, and I think it's becoming clearer and clearer by the day, is this the spark, the RMT dispute on the railways that is going to light the fire and that is going to be a whole new generalised movement of the workers in this country? Because I think if you look at the history of this country, every time there has been a major sellout and betrayal of the workers, and as a consequence a major defeat, it has actually been decades before that generalised movement starts again. In 1848, of course, there was a defeat of the Chartists, and it wasn't really until the late 1880s that with the advent of the new union movement, 40 years later, that there was a generalised movement of our class again. It's not to say that nothing happened in the intervening period, it did, but it wasn't generalised. In 1926, there was the betrayal of the TUC and the union leaders, the betrayal of the general strike. And after that, you know, there was the workers looked towards the electoral front, and then there was a betrayal of MacDonald and the Labour Party and going over and forming the national government, etc., etc. And it took the unions years of hard work, especially at a rank and file level, to build up again. And it wasn't really until the late 1960s that there was a generalised mood reasserting itself and the movement starting up again. I can just vaguely remember it, you know, in place of strife and, you know, the massive demonstrations that the trade unions organised against that, and major strikes taking place in the coal fields, issues like, you know, the Pentonville 5, when there was a spontaneous walkout on the docks, on the building sites amongst the print workers, and the ruling class was so afraid they had to release the Pentonville 5, who they'd imprisoned. But the point is, you know, between the betrayal of the general strike in 26, again, you know, another 4 decades before there's a generalised movement going again. In the mid 80s, first of all, there was defeat of the miners and then the printers in both of those disputes because, well, I believe because they were left isolated by the leaders of the other trade unions. They were winnable disputes, but we all know our history. Most of us were alive then. I think all of us were probably alive then. You know, that they were defeated, those disputes. And although there's been disputes, like Roger mentioned, like the doctors' dispute, like the UCU dispute, you know, go back a little bit further, you know, Fire Brigade union disputes and 1 or 2 others. The reality is there hasn't been a generalised movement for 35, you know, we're coming on for 4 decades again, 5 years away. But people are saying, is this it? Is the RMT railway dispute the spark that sets it off again? Now, a week ago, last Saturday, you know, we had the TUC We Demand Better demonstration. And I must admit, in my head, I was a little bit cynical about these sort of things. I've seen it all before, you know, 2010. You know, there was a massive turnout for TUC Saturday afternoon stroll around London. There was great expectations that this was the start of the fight back against austerity. It was no such thing. It was a bloody disaster because what the TUC did, and the same people, not exactly the same people, but, you know, the same organisation, same type of people did, was they organised another Saturday afternoon stroll around London a few months later. And then just to sort of throw the ruling class, what they did was for a 3rd time they organised a Saturday afternoon stroll around London, and gradually the demonstrations got smaller and smaller and smaller and fizzled out. I think what the lesson of that is that, you know, we should not be putting our trust in trade union leaders until they've actually proved themselves, especially trade union leaders who in the past have let us down again and again and again. It's only going to be through genuine trade unions, through rank and file trade union, rebuilding in the workplace, rebuilding in the branches, that we're going to be able to take on the Tories properly. But back to the question, you know, is this the spark that is going to start the fire of a generalised movement? And I think it is, because 8 days ago on that Saturday, I went on march. It was enjoyable. It was a good turnout, etc. But in my head, I was thinking, you know, all these people are going to be disappointed, going to be sold down the river again, so on, so forth. The rail strike started last week. I went to visit Lewisham railway station on Tuesday, on the first day, and it was very encouraging. You know, young people on the picket line, and you could talk to them properly as a trade unionist. It weren't, you know, people who'd read books and had a theory about what should and shouldn't happen. It was people who were living it, and were telling you about what's happening on the railways, and you can actually talk to them about day-to-day problems and issues. And I knew the lad that I was talking to must have been in his mid-20s. He was a new shop steward. He'd been doing it for about 6 months. Started talking about, you know, individual casework, bits and pieces like that. And you could tell he was a genuine person who was looking to do the job properly. And I began to think, if this is the sort of person we're getting involved in the trade unions, perhaps this is the start of a fight back. Then, of course, as I was watching the telly, as everyone else is, and that Mick Lynch, you know, I don't know the fellow, I don't know him from Adam, to be honest. I've only seen his performances on the telly, tearing Conservative MPs to pieces, calling them liars and showing up how they're liars. The media, I call the moral prostitutes of the media, the people who actually know, they must know that they're lying and bullshitting, but want to keep their six-figure salary job, attacked him and provoked him again and again, and he humiliated them. And yesterday, I went to the rally where Mick Lynch was speaking up in King's Cross. About 1,000 people turned up to it. You know, it was a very well attended rally, and you could feel that the class consciousness of workers is beginning to rise up. And I think to myself, you know, you've got the cost of living crisis, and everyone has got to be, unless you're very well off, everyone has got to be concerned about your energy bills, about going to the shops, and everything is more expensive every time you go to the shops. And the only way to fight back against it is to get organised in the workplace, organised in the union, and fight for higher wages and proper conditions. You know, I've heard a lot of this from the Tories and from their hirelings in the media about, oh, we don't want to go back to the 70s. Oh, of course we don't want to go back to the 70s. That was when we had, you know, 13 million people in trade unions. The overwhelming majority of workplaces were covered by trade union agreements. You got a proper contract of employment. You've got a reasonable basic wage. If you worked on a Saturday, you got time and a half. If you worked on a Sunday, you got double time. You got sick pay. You got well, of course, we don't want to go back to them days. You know, you wouldn't be able to make the rampant profits that you're making, would you? And, you know, I think to myself, these young people, like that lad that I met last week, who incidentally is going to come and speak on the dispute at our Socialist Sunday meeting next week. You've got people like that coming through and who are prepared to get stuck in at the workplace, then perhaps something is changing. And one of the things that got me yesterday when I was at King's Cross there, all of a sudden a big cheer went up, and marching down Euston Road was about 150 GMB members. They were people who worked with private contractors who'd been on strike, I think, for 8 or 9 days so far, in St George's Hospital in Tooting in South London. And they'd come all the way up to King's Cross and march down the Euston Road to join the rally. And you think, oh, that's good, you know, another little dispute that's taken off. Just talking to Roger before the start of this meeting. And, you know, we were, again, at Socialist Sunday, we had the main fella who's organising the Hackney local government dispute and the Unite members. And Roger was saying, yeah, the same's happening in Newham with the dust. They're balloting for strike action. Over here in Bexley, we're going to get the result of the ballot strike action on the dust for the second bout of industrial action. That's due tomorrow. And you start looking at these things and you look, 115,000 postal workers are starting their national ballot next Tuesday. On Thursday, you're getting the result coming through of the national ballot that's taken place amongst British telecom workers. You've got the teachers union, the NEU, saying if we don't get a wage offer in line with the rate of inflation, we're going to be balloting for industrial action. You've got the doctors, the nurses, the barristers, as been mentioned. I opened up the Facebook this morning, sad person that I am, first thing you do, look at it. And there was a thing on there from Tony Greenstein in Brighton. And I thought it was going to be about the rail dispute and the picket they had down there yesterday. No, I opened it up and it's one of these new unions, the UVW. And there's a massive strike down there in an outlet that sells beer and all these posh foods and what have you. And they've been treating the workers like that, and they're out on strike. And everywhere you look, there's threats of national action, there's ballots, there's localised disputes going on. I really do believe that this could be the start of it. But of course, what does that actually mean? I think it was Lenin who said the number of strikes and the level of trade union organisation is not a barometer. You can gauge the confidence and the combativity of the working class. And of course, that's absolutely true. But as well as that, and for mere mortals like ourselves, it's how could you put it? It's the pride and self-respect and seeing people for the first time. A lot of these young people, remember, they ain't seen the miners' strike and the printers' strike. They haven't read the history. All they've known since they've been working is do as you're told. The dreadful bloody conditions that people are having to work under, that's normality to them. They haven't got another period to look back at and say, oh, it was better in the 1970s. They think this is normal. So to us, is this the time, after 35 years when we're going to stand up and another? To them, it's a lifetime. It's an absolute lifetime. And so they must be thinking, it doesn't have to be like this. You stood up, you got off your knees, you turned around, you said, I ain't going to take it no more. And of course, this is happening up and down the country. And because of what we've seen, and whether it was intentional or not, but this Mick Lynch sort of humiliating these paid hirelings in the Conservative Party, these MPs, these television broadcasters and that, millions are actually watching this. And so millions for the first time, especially younger workers, are thinking, yeah, it doesn't have to be like this. And, this is another criticism, and have a go at me if you think I'm wrong. But I think, you look at the Corbyn movement, And there was far too much of this bloody hero worshipping. Jeremy's going to sort it out for us. People used to stand in a muddy field singing, "Ooh, Jeremy Corbyn." And I used to look at that and think, well, that ain't going to do no bleeding good. Join the union, get yourself organised in the workplace, get yourself organised in the branches. Then we can create a movement that actually means something. And just before I was coming to this meeting, in panic stations, as usual, I'm looking for inspiration I was reading James Connolly. And it was about industrial unionism against, the AFL, the IWW, International Workers of the World, back in the night. And he was talking about building a socialist party. And his argument was that to build a socialist party worth anything, and I would say a leadership worth anything, we've got to get ourselves organised in the workplace, because it's no good actually learning the theory in isolation. It's no good doing the practice in isolation. The theory and the practice have to go together. And I've always sort of I say always, I've developed this thought in my head that it is not and or, it's both. And people have given me analogies in the past of building the trade union movement as if it's like building a house. And they say, building rank and file trade unionism is like laying the foundations of the house. And people have been critical of others who wanted to, like the Corbyn movement, build a bloody house from the top down. And I think there is some legitimacy in that. But I think to myself, there's no point in building the foundations if you're not going to build a bloody house on top of it. So it's not a question of and or. We've got to do both. We've got to rebuild strong unions, and we've got to build new leadership. We can argue till the cows come home, and we'll no doubt will do, about whether it should be inside the Labour Party, outside, and so on, so forth. But let's get these foundations right, because I do honestly believe that this time this could be the rebirth of our movement.
Thank you very much, Steve. Listening to such a articulate and well thought out contribution to the meeting, it's very, very hard to imagine that you were panic stricken and looking for inspiration an hour or so before the meeting. That came over really, really well. And, it sets a very good background, a very good tone for what no doubt will be a very interesting discussion. We've already got hands coming up. The first hand I saw up is Jackie Hyatt. So could you unmute yourself? Oh, okay. All right. Well, anyway, it's on your line. So please come in, whoever that is.
Larry.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Ed, and thank you very much, Steve and Roger, for their excellent contributions. And I don't disagree with either party in their analysis of what's going on. But what I will say is, I don't believe there is a spark. What the thing is, it's an opportunity. And we've been given opportunities in the past with the miners' strike and the print workers' dispute. It's what we do with it. And one of the things I'll mention straight away is Mick Lynch has got the platform at the moment, and he needs to politicise the working class with that platform. You can't just limit it to the RMT dispute. He has to draw upon the movement. And one of the ways that both the miners and the print workers did was that they consolidated their politicisation of the strikes with support groups through trades councils and political meetings within workplaces that did not have the association with that particular industry. And And one of the things that needs to be done whilst the orienteering dispute and the other disputes that have been mentioned is the politicisation of striking workers. And that is the only thing that's going to bring about the mass movement that is required. Whether a party comes from that or not, I couldn't tell, and I'm not. I can't foresee. I can't tell the future on that. And this is where the Corbyn project went wrong. We didn't build a mass movement. He was interested in a mass party without the foundation, as Steve has rightly said. And I do take an issue on the June the 18th rally in London. Yes, it was, Steve, another, as we said before, a walk and a stroll around London. But I listened to Ian Hodgson, the Bakers Union, the other night, which was facilitated through Roger. And that was that the TUC, or the people on that demonstration, needed to galvanise that strength and use it as a platform into action. There needs to be action following those particular demonstrations. It's good to hear Roger's enthusiasm about the 18th, but it needs to be a proven springboard to action as to what we do beyond that. And that's only going to come from rank and file trade unions at this particular stage. It's not going to come from the TUC. When organising pickets, like the one that Steve mentioned in Euston Road, it's a good demonstration, but we need to go out, and Steve and I have done this in the past, is that when you use that opportunity to go into other workplaces that have no association with the demonstration outside and try and talk to workers within there and tell them about the issues. It's nice to listen to speakers like Mick Lynch on a demonstration, but at the same time, we need to get into workplaces that are can I say, not associated with class struggle. The other thing is that if agency workers are used as strike breakers, then we've got to extend the dispute to include the agencies themselves. We can't just allow the agency workers to take over and run services in that fashion. We have to, and this is where the politicalisation of the dispute comes into its own. We have to spread it. And if the agencies are used, then we have to take them on as well. It's a bit like the food banks. You know, everybody's accepting the fact that we've got food banks, but what we ought to be doing is we've got this crisis of cost of living crisis. What we ought to be doing, like they did in the unemployed workers organisations, was we should occupy the supermarkets, give the food away free. You know, come to us in the soup. We're politicising the food banks. Occupy the supermarkets, give the food away. And while I mentioned the unemployed workers organisation, because when they had no work, they went and occupied the Savoy Hotel, places like that, sat down in the restaurant. You know, bring the fight to them instead of having to defend ourselves all the time. Anyway, thank you very much, Ed.
Thanks very much, comrade. Now, can I just say, there's a little bit of noise in the background. If you're not speaking in the meeting, could you please make sure that your microphone is muted? The next speaker in the discussion is Peter Sinclair.
Thanks, Ed. Hi, comrades. This country is in its biggest crisis since the war. There isn't any doubt about that. And I think the people last Thursday spoke, particularly in Tiverton and Honiton, and to a lesser degree in Wakefield. There was no comfort in the vote in Wakefield for the Labour Party either, because they actually polled 5,000 votes less than Jeremy Corbyn did in 2019. So where do we go from here? I think my views on trade unionism is well known. I've been a member of the same union for 58 years and secretary of one of the oldest boilermaker branches in the UK, well, Great Britain as it happens, for 15 years until it closed in 1992 due to shipyard closures. Steve's right, of course, as is Roger. There's no industry anymore to where we had sort of mass branches. And as a result of that, and as a result of the check-off, which was introduced and embraced by the trade union movement and paid by the employer on behalf of the employee, meant that the branches at one time, which could herald quite a number of members present at the appropriate times, drifted away, disappeared, in fact, in many cases. Now, that's not just the Boilermakers, that was right across the board. Wherever you were a trade union movement, there would be a check-off system. So back to this crisis. What can be done? The movement by the RMT must not be an isolated movement. The RMT must not be allowed to hang out to dry by the trade union movement as were the miners. The miners 40 years ago were the catalyst to a general strike. It should have taken place then. They sat on their hands. They've been sitting on their hands since. And Steve's right again, of course. The only way we're going to get action is from below. But I don't see it coming from the trade union branches. I see it coming from the streets. I see it coming from the women. I see it coming from the youth. I see it coming from all over the place, quite frankly, because some of the people I've spoken to throughout the UK are up to here and a bit further to Tory. It's got to a situation now where unless somebody does something quick, there's going to be bloodshed on the streets. That's what's going to happen. I don't think there's any way you're going to stop it. You've got the crisis that we're in is nothing to what's coming. We know about the can't pay, won't pay. We know people won't be able to heat the homes. It's not possible because the money isn't there. And then in October, there's going to be another hike. How on earth can you have another hike when you can't even pay the one they're imposing on us now? And in the meanwhile, these billionaires grow ever more as time marches on. And still, the trade union movement sits on its hands. It will be the people that cause this to happen. And the RMP is a spur. Mick Lynch speaks volumes. He speaks from the heart and he needs to be followed. And if the trade union movement won't follow it, then the people will and must. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Peter. Next speaker I'm going to call is Carol Lang.
Hi, everybody. I think it's pretty clear from what's going on, not only in Britain, which is really exciting, that there's a showdown going to happen. And it's going to happen. I went to a demonstration yesterday because now abortion is banned in the United States. And spontaneously 20,000 people came out on the streets of New York. But anyway, so I'm wondering, it's clearly that things have gone to a major crisis in Britain. And I'm just wondering if anybody among you or anywhere is building an alternative party to the Labour Party, because the Labour Party historically has sold out the workers. And I've just been reading more about the 1926 strike, and the Labour Party, the whole entire trade union bureaucracy collapsed and gave in to the bourgeoisie, wreaking tremendous havoc on the working class for years to come. And then there was a depression. The Communist Party clearly, it was already a Stalinized party, had already fallen down on the job, did not mount any sort of alternative in any real way, except for the minority movement to the bourgeoisie. And this is going to be a time where, it's going to be socialism or barbarism. I don't think there's any I think everybody is right. There's really not going to go back to any sort of calm or you know, negotiations. Johnson is on the warpath. The bourgeoisie in the United States is on the war. This is happening all over. And so I'm wondering, I think it's important to start building a revolutionary party in Britain, not waiting for the trade unions. I mean, I think we have to build trade unions and trade union movement, but not waiting for that to happen, because we want to bring it to the point where people understand that this showdown is going to happen. Because if not, then the working class is going to be the loser again. And Johnson is already talking about going to war with Russia. So, you know, this is going to be socialism or barbarism. And I'm just wondering about people on the ground over there, whether they're building things and trying to connect up, you know, political and all of that with the idea of creating socialism and connecting up internationally with people who all around the world are going through similar crises as the British working class is now. But it sounds wonderful and exciting. And anyway, that's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Carol. I'll just say, if there are any other female comrades who want to speak in the meeting, they too will be given a bit of priority in the queue. But at the moment in the queue, the next speaker is, well, comes from the equipment of Dominic Byrne. I don't know which of the Byrne brothers it is who wants to speak.
I think Darren's first, isn't it? Well, no, it's called.
Well,
it's John speaking. John Byrne speaking.
Go for it, John, and Darren will be next.
Okay. This last week, I mean, I've been struck down with COVID, so can't get out and do much. But this last week, I saw 2 television programs that I thought were extremely enlightening. The first one, which really made my blood boil, was Question Time on the BBC. And in that, Mick Lynch was explaining the situation, how not only had the employers wanted to make redundancies and cut wages, change hours and conditions, etc. But at the latest round of talks, they'd introduced a new redundancy package of 2,900 workers to be made redundant. And the audience in Question Time really got up my nose, or many of them did, because they said, well, so what? And he said, well, this means that they want to get rid of 2,900 workers. Oh, no, they don't. It'll all be on a voluntary basis. And you've got this stupid ignorance among sections of the British middle class that really got up my nose. In contrast, by accident, I tuned into Radio Éireann yesterday, their Radio 1 programme, and lo and behold, there was an interview with Mick Lynch. Now, the Irish are very patriotic, and even when their football teams lose at World Cups, they have a victory parade. So Mick Lynch was treated like royalty. He was listened to. The interviewer asked him how the strike was going. He was given every opportunity to explain how the strike was going. And then they got on to different attitudes. The fact that Mick Lynch had been given a very rough ride by certain commentators in Sky News and the BBC, etc., and how he'd ridden it out and done a really good job. And then they got talking about politics, and Mick Lynch has a very strong working class background from, I think, round the Paddington, area of London, or Euston area of London, and explained how he'd grown up on a council estate, how, if you like, the main thing was working class. That's what you were. He was Irish. there were other people who were Asian, there were other people who were British or English, but they all got on together. And that really, you know, to my mind, expressed what he was about. The fact is that he was basically working class, and he could see the ruling class, as Roger said earlier, this sort of gangster spiv element of, if you like, hedge fund managers, property speculators, and all the rest of it ripping off. And when it came down to it, you know, the working class were expected to sit meekly by and see wage cuts, terms and conditions eroded. And the fact is that he was there representing his members and fighting back against it. Now there's talk of where will this movement go? Well, I think one of the most encouraging signs was in fact at Heathrow, where the workers at British Airways have voted overwhelmingly for strike action. And again, like the 2,900 redundancies was a provocation to Mick Lynch and the RMT, Heathrow is a provocation to those workers there. Pardon me. The situation's one that at the start of COVID, there was a 10% cut in wages accepted by all workers. But recently, that 10% has been reinstated for management and senior staff, but not for, pardon me, not for, if you like, the check-in staff, the baggage handlers, etc. And this is an absolute provocation, because at the moment they're striking over reinstating what's been taken off them. And, you know, there's a 90% vote for strike action. 80%. But what was encouraging about it, that after the ballot, from what I understand, the workers at Heathrow were ringing around the country to get support from other workers. And I think that's the way things are going to develop. That there is, if you like, a certain limited faith in the trade union leadership. But if the trade union leadership don't do their job, then they will be circumvented, and, if you like, avenues will be opened up to gain support. And I think the other thing that really tells volumes was Keir Starmer's diktat that shadow cabinet members should not attend picket lines. Well, there wasn't a massive turnout, but at least a dozen MPs turned up to a picket line. So the Tories are now goading Keir Starmer. What's he going to do about it? Well, Keir Starmer, in my opinion, can do nothing about it, because if he does, that will really spark a revolt in the Labour Party, because the feeling is that Keir Starmer is living on fresh air at the moment. He's doing virtually nothing to forward the interests of the working class. And I think this is getting through to the shadow cabinet and to the Parliamentary Labour Party. So I'll leave it at there.
Thank you, Dominic. The next speaker is Darren, and then I'm going to Pam. Darren.
Hello, thank you, Ed. Thank you for that. I think, you know, we've all, it's all been very interesting, you know, what we've heard so far. And of course it is very true, the kind of primary role that is played by organised workers. But I think we should also raise the importance of political campaigning or the political struggle. I think other comrades here have kind of touched upon that. I probably, of all the kind of British contributors, I'll probably come from one of the more kind of backwater areas. I'm on the Isle of Wight, where we did have the local refuse workers did threaten strike action and got a small pay rise, and good for them for that. We've got about 6 miles of rail track. Every part of the country will be touched by strike action, but I tend to sort of, a lot of my thinking is geared partly towards kind of smaller town Britain, and I think a counties probably like Kent or Devon, maybe excluding Plymouth, but places like that, which are kind of agglomerations of small towns, towns of 50,000, 100,000. Even like a lot of the red wall towns, but I think you add that up and it's all very important. And I think there's a lot of those places, I dare say, the local left is still quite kind of small and fragmented. And I think we're at a position now where we have to kind of work out how do we kind of build from there. I think what other comrades say about the trade union leadership is absolutely right. They're not going to kind of build that, they're not going to lay the foundations of a new political party, and even like a kind of movement that kind of would surround a political party. I think, a movement that would be a kind of lifeblood of that. I think they can coordinate some strike action, but I think their political mindset is overall, I think, is somewhat limited. That said, I mean, the RMT have been part of Tusk for a number of years, and Tusk is certainly one of the strands that is, pushing in the direction of creating a new party. I think whilst I raised the kind of, the importance of kind of, and the role of small town Britain, and I kind of cite that as an example, I think we also need to kind of give it the big picture. The difference between now and I think the 70s, that we're really in a kind of runaway international crisis. I think whether that, certainly the climate change issue, I think certainly just the financialization of economies like Britain and the US have created this kind of just chaos that will kind of manifest itself and is likely to manifest itself possibly in the next 2 or 3 years. You look at, you only have to kind of read between the lines in the financial crisis, and you will see that scenario is quite likely. And certainly, we might be confronting a position in Britain where Keir Starmer is at the head of a Labour Liberal coalition, is kind of is in the position he's faced with bailing the bankers out and kind of leaving the rest to sort of fend for themselves, as Brown did in 2008. And so when we think of that situation, we think of climate change and massive issues that are just not going away, and ultimately which are the fault of kind of just profiteering and a failure of regulation. I'd probably add in, just the absolute sort of decimation of public services that have occurred, particularly here, and also in the, US. Those are consequences in neoliberalism, and I think those are big things. Those are big issues that we'll be having conversations with. I think, with people over, and I think, it's at the moment the left is still very fragmented. I think some people are going to continue with the Labour Party and be pragmatic because they see that there's there's an opportunity to get the Tories out and to get Labour in, and that maybe with some of the movements that are occurring, people might be able to push Starmer to the left. I don't myself believe that that's a very realistic scenario, but with overall, I think that the left is very fragmented, and I think we at a local level, what I try to do, I think is try to kind of bring a lot of those kind of strands together, a lot of those political strands, you know, and hopefully, you know, this strike wave will provide something of a catalyst. It will kind of embolden a few people, will give people a bit of confidence. But I think, you know, I'm fully aware that I think the major tasks are kind of, you know, a politicization. I think, you know, in the absence of Starmer really kind of offering any bold policies, I think, you know, we as a movement have to do that. I think we have to find, you know, some common ground. That, you know, that's been a problem on the, you know, on the left. I think that we can all kind of agree on generally what's wrong with the system, but I think actually coming together, you know, is a different issue altogether. You know, there are breakaways from the Labour Party, you know, small parties break through, and there's left unity, etc., etc. There are there's Tusk as well, and some of the other former Stalinist parties, some of the Trotskyists, etc., etc. And, you know, there have been plenty of initiatives that haven't really completely gotten off the ground. And so, you know, I think we are, you know, there's a challenge there. I'm not necessarily providing solutions, but I think, you know, I do think, you know, I do believe that it's, you know, that is probably critical in a way. You know, the strikes will come and go. You know, we'll be outside the tube stations and the hospitals and wherever, you know, over the summer, giving a bit of solidarity. But I think, you know, the kind of ongoing task is really a political one. Thank you, Ed.
Okay, thank you very much, Darren. I'm going to go to Pam now. After that, I'm going to call Felicity. Pam.
Okay, thanks, Ed. Well, Darren's just said half the things I was about to say. I was going to respond to Carol's question about whether there are any attempts to build a new left political party in Britain, and Darren's right. There are a whole number of groups have sprung up. Tusk, who have been around for quite a long time, that's essentially allied to the Socialist Party. The Northern Independents, the Breakthrough Party. There's loads and loads and loads of these parties that at the moment are acting as fractured groups. Because I think one of the great things about Jeremy Corbyn, I feel he failed in many ways. He created an umbrella of people of quite wide views of around the left, and everybody came together towards the Labour Party to support that movement. And I think we need to recreate that in some sort of way by bringing everybody back together again. So that these are good initiatives that people are doing. Just another couple of groups to mention is the, as everybody knows, very many people have been ejected from the Labour Party, initially supposedly anti-Semitism. Of course, as time's gone on, it's become more and more obvious. It was never about anti-Semitism. It was always the left-wingers that were being ejected from the Labour Party. So a couple of groups that I can mention that I'm involved with, one was the Labour Left Alliance was formed to support people on the left who are still in the Labour Party. Now, unfortunately, that organisation has largely become defunct now because most of its original members have probably now been ejected from the Labour Party. At the moment, Win was actually affiliated to a Labour Left Alliance, and we've got members on their steering committee. And the other group that I'll mention is the Socialist Labour Network, which was formed from secretaries and chairs and various people who are witch hunted out of the Labour Party, and that's another group now that's formed and is more sort of geared towards the grassroots. I think one thing that's important to mention is New Socialist Labour. I'm sure Roger will talk about in a minute, who were formed in Newham, and it's the two Labour parties that were suspended. Newham North East and Newham North West, and they stood a load of councillors at the last elections and actually did really, really well. The candidate for mayor got 5,000 votes, and this was they weren't even a political party. They were just a group of ex-Labour Party members, and did fantastically well. And it just got, and then they went round, the grassroots work, knocked on doors, went from door to doors, talked to people, got incredible support really. So you can see there's a real thirst for a left alternative. So I think it's like Darren says, it's a question of how we're going to get everybody together. But I think industrial action is the way forward. The Labour Party was formed as the political wing of the trade union movement, and I think we can see this again, that the true trade union movement will find its own voice and will spearhead and sort of somehow gathered together all these people that are all split up all over the place. I think that's all I was going to say, but I think it's more or less what Darren says. I hope that answers your question a bit, Carol. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Pam. I'm going to call Felicity now, and after that, I'm going to Steve Zeltzer. Felicity, please come in.
Hi, comrades. I'm very much with Roger that the social attitudes of many people in the UK are with the left. We are an underrepresented group in politics, and the the media would have it that we don't exist. Starmer would have it that we don't exist. But the statistics that Roger was citing about the number of young people who support Corbyn, the percentage of young females between 18 and 24 who see themselves as being strongly socialist is really big. And we see when issues come up that the youth are prepared to take action, are prepared to get involved. And that's good, but that's not organised. Comrades are right that that's not organised, but we do need to have that clear picture that we might not be in a position of huge dominance, but we are a very significant section of the population, and that needs to be built on. In Liverpool yesterday, we had a rally for the RMT, and yeah, if the revolution starts, it's going to start in Liverpool. And for all, it was a brilliant rally, and it was truly a brilliant rally. It wasn't the size of the time when Corbyn turned up to speak in Liverpool. Quite unexpectedly, 10,000 people turned out. This was, closer to 500 people. But we had 4 MPs there, all consciously on the picket line and metaphorically putting 2 fingers up to Starmer. The black woman MP for Riverside literally telling Starmer what he could do. If they were told not to stand with workers. But there were also lots of young people there and new people we didn't particularly know. So, the mood was great. I've been to one particular small picket each day of the strike. Beautiful weather, really good company, sitting in the sunshine, discussing politics with people on strike, can't really beat it. But we've got to be careful, this is great, but we can't say it's, we don't know its significance yet. We know that Sharon in Unite has been able to focus on industrial disputes, and that they are winning quite a few of those industrial disputes. And she is genuinely using the union for industrial disputes, and I think that's a big change. In the P&O dispute, frankly, we were smashed. The employers moved in, took the jobs from those people and employed other people instead. And it was the same union, it was RMT. So we can't be, overly enthusiastic. I really do think it was great yesterday, and the strike's been great. Darren from the Isle of Wight, I think we've got to, basically, where there is a small left, we've got to do what we can to find ways of working together in the different areas. And that's not just by discussing, because that way we will find also the things we disagree with, but in actions. I mean, saying let's get a stall in the street in favour of the RMT or against the price rises. Let's do something together to see what can be done to build the links. The big issue that's not, and I think is sitting there, a sleepy elephant in the room is the NHS pay. The staff of the NHS are leaving, not just because of pay, but they're leaving because of their working conditions and the dangers that they're placed in, and exhaustion. But something has to happen with the nurses' pay. Something has to happen, and it might have to be that we in, the trade unions, in the trades councils, in things like Unite Community, start beginning to campaign again on that issue. It's a very serious one. One other thing on the issue of linking with the left, of course, left unity has been around, and thank you very much. We're doing quite well. We're not newcomers anymore, and we operate with PALS, which is the People's Alliance of the Left, and that does. It's always hard work, but it does link the different left groups. And if you're in the left group that's not linked to PALS, please do get linked to PALS. We're not prepared to work with people who've got bad records in the past on issues like women's rights. So we're not prepared to work with George Galloway, which has been a sticking point as far as Tusk is concerned, that they want to work with Galloway. But we're still going to work with Tusk. But PALS is there if anyone wants to do something about linking the left. And then a final point, the Wade v. Roe decision in the American Supreme Court is not just relevant in the States, it's a risk to every woman everywhere. And during the terrible debates around the health and care bill that went through recently, there was a free vote on whether or not to allow, what had happened in the pandemic, which is women to apply for pills to be sent by post to take for an early abortion. Fortunately, it was a free vote, and 77 Tories voted with women's rights. But take your 77 from the number of Tory MPs that there are, and there are hundreds of Tory MPs who do not stand with women's rights. And if in this tug and to and fro that we're going to have with the government, if it's perfectly possible, they could start playing that card as well. So, please make sure that whatever you do, you're involved in campaigns to defend women's abortion rights and to raise that as a really important political issue. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Felicity. I'm going to go to David Hempson now. Oh no, hang on. Sorry. I'm going to go to Steve Zeltzer now, and after that, I'm calling David Hempson. Steve, please come in.
Okay, I think that this is obviously a new world economic, social period that we're in. Never in the history of the world working class have we faced this. With climate, with all the different issues, imperialist war, and the pandemic, all these things combined have exacerbated this crisis of capitalism. I think that in the United States as well, there's a rise of fascism. And I think that we can't discount that internationally because the answer to this capitalist crisis for the bourgeoisie is fascism. And we have to take it very seriously. And I think that the Republicans coming to power in the United States, which is likely at this point, is going to transform the whole political international situation. I think, what can we do? I mean, what we're doing in the United States is building a united front movement to unite workers around class issues and democratic issues. I mean, a united front against privatization, to bring workers together throughout the country, healthcare, teachers, public service workers around a united front. What the trade union bureaucracy in the United States do not want to do is to unite all workers who are facing the same fights. I mean, unlike Britain, despite my disagreements with the TUC leadership, they actually called a rally. They actually called a march. In the United States, the AFL-CIO is terrified of calling a mass demonstration, a mass workers' march, because they're fearful that it will get out of control politically, that there'll be a link up of workers nationally. So I think that fight for a united front can lead to a political, independent political party, the working class. A working class party has to come out of the actual struggles of the working class, of workers uniting politically, independently of the capitalist class. It's not going to come out by a call by a party, an ultimatum that you have to have a working class party. So I see that as a organic process of forming a mass working class party, democratic mass working class party. The other thing is imperialist war. And it's quite clear that the trade union bureaucracy do not want to have a struggle around war. I know at the AFL-CIO convention and at the Labor Notes convention, not a word about Ukraine and what the policy of the working class should be towards Ukraine and the unions, because I think that we're not going to be able to avoid the fact that this war against China, against Russia, is going to require, it's going to lead to explosions in the working class here. The workers can't get to work in the United States with $6 a gallon, where workers have to go sometimes 100, 200 miles to work. So this is going to lead to an explosion in the working class. And our position has to be that in the unions and in the working class movement, we have to talk about the war. It's an imperialist war. Workers are paying for it in Ukraine. Workers are paying for it in Britain, in the United States, and around the world. There are collapses of governments now. Ecuador, I mean, is on the face of a collapse. Sri Lanka. This is a global situation. South Africa, what this war is doing. And I think if we're going to confront the attacks facing the working class, we have to start with what is happening globally in the world economy and the imperialist, inter-imperialist rivalry that's developed and been intensified by this. Last point, I think there's going to be a depression, likely big depression. I don't think that these capitalist economies are going to be able to maintain with the broken supply chains, the sanctions, and it's going to lead to mass unemployment. And that's what we're facing. And that will further radicalize the working class. But if we don't have an organization for the working class and with the working class, that's even more of a danger of fascist movement growing. So I think it's not just a union problem. It's a mass international working class problem. There's a political vacuum. I don't think the unions can solve that problem. And the unions in Britain, the unions in the United States don't even want to talk about that crisis. So I think that's what we have to talk about, how we can develop a united front perspective, uniting the working class around their struggles, bringing them together, fighting for a new working class power and leadership to confront these challenges.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. Dave Hempson next, and after that, I'm going to call Matthew.
Comrades, look, thanks, Steve and Roger, for some marvelous contributions, and others too. I want to look at some of the basic issues here, and then talk about, the working class's loss of control over every single part of what is called a public sector or a declining public sector, and what maybe we should take up about that. First of all, inflation in Britain is 9.1%, and the offer to the railway workers is 3%. I mean, it's stupendous. It's unbelievable, really, that they could have the audacity to throw such a scrap to the workers and to expect them to accept that. And I think the RMT leadership has done a fantastic job in absolutely shattering the argument that Boris Johnson, the employers and others have been making, that the workers shouldn't mobilize and struggle, as they are doing. And it's absolutely marvelous. See, 40,000 workers now mobilized and on strike with public support, and overwhelming public support, even from sections of the middle class and elsewhere, because they can see just where it's going. Now, Boris Johnson has justified all of this and is fighting firmly and unambiguously with the employers. He says this is part of an attempt to reconstruct the rail system in Britain. And I've been following this, living in Britain at times and using the rail system. I've been able to compare it, with what I've seen in Europe and elsewhere. And it's pathetic beyond belief that this is the argument that the Conservative Party is putting forward. When we see in Germany, these rail system is almost overloaded now because they had a special deal. So I think people pay the equivalent of something like £10 no matter where you go. You can go for hundreds of miles and pay £10. The system is being used to cut down the demand for fossil fuel, for cars and so forth, and to provide relief to poor people who have never been able to travel and to actually enjoy a holiday this summer. Now, that is like light years away from what we see in Britain, where we have 13 operating systems, privately owned, trying to get the massive profit that they can, the highest level of profit that they can, at the expense, of course, of the workers, but also of people who use the system. And in my view, the system is appalling and even worse than I experienced, in the 1970s and 80s when I used it, quite considerably worse, because you just don't know what's happening. If you move from one station to the other, you don't know what system you're going to be engaged with. It just doesn't work. And this is what the capitalist class is saying is an answer to the system, to the crisis, or looking forward to developing a proper rail system of being able to see people using it extensively, for work and for recreation. There's in the past there was talk of a high-speed rail system in Britain. They even experimented with all kinds of dynamic systems. That's all gone. There's no talk of public investment to lever up the rail system in Britain to make it anywhere near equivalent to that of Europe or let's even not face it, of China, where it's actually much quicker to use rail than to fly. There's not a hint of that. So I feel that the workers' struggle is now exposing the Conservatives and actually all political parties to the most extraordinary stress, because I think ordinary people, working people and middle class are seeing that the system is just not working. They've lost control of whatever control they had. We've got declining systems, and in no way is the British rail or the bits and pieces of British rail in any way comparable to that of Europe or anywhere else, in the world. And can I say that the revival of the labor movement in Britain, which I think Rogers has set out and others have given firmer evidence to, is going to be an enormous pole of attraction internationally. I have to report that Zimbabwean comrades were wanting to participate, but because of a complete collapse of the electricity at this moment, they were unable to do so. But they wanted to hear what's happening in the labor movement, because that really affects conditions in Zimbabwe and elsewhere. In the past, we looked to Jack Jones, we looked to General Secretary, we looked to the TNG, the Transport Workers Union, and elsewhere as a guide to what is going to happen in the labor movement internationally. And once again, we'll be watching the British labor movement and the British trade unions to see what rank and file from bottom up are going to be active in transforming our trade unions and making them a real instrument of the working class. Thanks.
Thanks, David. I just want to provide information, particularly for the benefit of comrades who are not in the UK, who maybe haven't had the opportunity to be on picket lines. This dispute of railway workers, although wages do come into it, is not primarily about wages, is primarily about defending jobs. There are a whole number of what they call modernizations, what the management call modernizations, which effectively mean cutting jobs, things like the amount of staff that are available to service the tracks and the amount of staff on trains and so on. And it's got very big implications for the livelihoods of future generations, because people rely on work like that. But it's also got implications for the safety of the railway system, the maintenance and safety of the system. These workers do want a wage rise as well, but that's not the primary issue in the strike. And the media have tried to portray it as if wages are the primary issue, because they hope that will turn other workers against the railway workers. Anyway, I'm going to call Matthew in. I'm conscious that we're getting towards the time where we better start thinking about winding up the meeting as well. And I see Jim's got his hand up. Felicity, your hand is up. I don't know if that's still up from your previous contribution.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just trying to sort of gauge what time we have before we begin to. So anyway, please come in, Matthew.
Yeah, thanks, comrades. I'm sorry I got here late. Other issues, but I think that, I mean, the thing that this is what I like to see in these in the moment is one. I think that it is the effort. The problem we got really in this in Britain, and I think in most places, of course, is the effort of the ruling class to restructure, everything, and to actually to get rid of much of the established workforce. If you look at it, certainly in Britain, I mean, much of what the sort of classic engineering, etc., heavy industry was deliberately removed, and I mean that, of course, then has a huge impact on both into the organisation of the working class itself, political consciousness, and into politics, and we're still working our way through that. And I think that the problem is because of that, I mean, you're looking at a situation where essentially the left is still surviving on the basis of people who've been around for decades. And I mean, you can see this in the Corbyn thing, because the principal people actually who were involved in the whole Corbyn upsurge were of a certain age. It wasn't led by youth. It was led by those of in their 50s and so on. And so as far as I can see, I mean, Scotland, of course, is different, but from what I could see, that was how it worked. So it's first of all, obviously, that huge attack and the move to finance capital and so on, and the restructuring, and the question of how does the working class actually organise itself. Secondly, obviously, the other thing, of course, is that the ruling class clearly has also attempted to remove the left and to cut down the left, and particularly, obviously, we can see this if you look in higher education. They have attempted to clear the left out of higher education. It's a conscious thing. They've done it, and you can look at most universities and so on. Obviously, with not only just the casualisation of the workforce, but it's also a political attack to remove left organisation from that layer of people, and that also has had some success and has changed things drastically in those terms, in terms of any forum for debate of politics. So what we've got is a tremendous political confusion, enormous political confusion as it stands at the moment, and a lack of any real understanding of Marxism in particular. And I think this is the problem that for me, I think is actually then also to look at and say, right, at the same time, we've also had all of the different tendencies of the left in the working class have collapsed. All of them. We could go through, I mean, certainly in Britain, you could go through them all, whether that's the Communist Party and whatever else you can say about Stalinism, whether that's the different tendencies of Trotskyism, whether you're talking about ISSWP, whether you're talking about the Ted Grant the militant, whether you're talking about Jerry Healy and the International Committee, all of which, of course, had huge impact on not just in Britain, but on a world scale. But all of those tendencies have collapsed. And not only that, of course, they've collapsed in a way in which, in large part, there's been no lesson taken out of it. There's many of them, in many cases, they've collapsed through assorted ridiculous feuds, sex cases, etc., etc. So what you're seeing is politics being driven backwards. And the question really, and I think that, you know, I agree with a lot of what's being said, but what actually is required is the question is, you know, can the working class, from within the working class, and it is organically linked, has to be organically linked to the movement of the working class, is there a revolutionary current of any, you know, purchasability and with a root in serious sections of the working class that can be you know, brought together, because that's the key missing element. And that stands obviously for many countries, not just here, but also in the US, you know, in particular. And obviously, you know, as Steve has said, the US ruling class is now opening the whole question and saying, you know, we are going to start removing your democratic rights. I mean, they're doing it here to a degree. You can see it with all these ridiculous police bills and so on. But when they start turning around and saying, well, an entire section of the population, you know, on the basis of a group of unelected reactionaries, that you're no longer going to have the right to reproductive rights, you know. And not only that, to say at the same time, well, this is only the start. We intend to remove, you know, a whole series of other rights by the same mechanism. You know, so really, you're seeing this frontal attack, and you know, we have to look at it as not country by country on a world scale, and say, right, okay, well, you know, clearly this is the main thing that we are missing, as I say, is the need. You know, why is it we're in the situation with the revolutionary left as it stands, and what can we actually do about it? How can we bring together, you know, a serious current, you know, which is obviously is not national. I mean, these things obviously always and rightly are international things, and that is the key. And you can see, I mean, you can see it through the actually, of course, the lack of the whole issue of the unions. And I think, you know, for me, I think it's great that we've got this you know, this upsurge, but I think we do have to be deeply critical of the union bureaucracy, because obviously on its political basis, we wouldn't expect it to be able to fight the ruling class, and it doesn't. And then the problem is that, you know, if we look at the RMT dispute, we can say, okay, well, the dispute, as you say, is about safety and employment and so on, but the union itself position has taken and said, well, you know, it's not a question of saying, well, we demand this level of safety on the railways, and therefore you must employ X number of people, or you can't remove jobs that are safety critical. What it is saying is no compulsory redundancies. You know, it's a different question. If people are prepared to say, I'll take money and go out of the industry, fine, you know, but that doesn't actually say you're actually defending the safety of the industry at all. You know, all you're saying is that people will say, okay, I will sell my job for X amount of money, which is, I mean, you know, is the way it works in these parts. But it's a different position than, say, you had with the NUM in the miners' strike, when they said, well, we no pit closures except on the grounds of exhaustion, which is a completely different basis and entirely much more of a challenge to the system than what we're seeing at the moment. You know, at the same time, the problem is, of course, I mean, we can see all these different disputes coming towards us, you know, but are these things actually all going to flow together? The key question for me under the current conditions is, you know, can we get to the point where we don't have a single group of workers effectively isolated, you know, in struggle with the government, which is how Thatcher did it. I mean, if you look at the whole series, and you look at from the whole point from the Ridley Plan in the middle 70s, they said, we'll take you on one at a time in salami slices and make sure we isolate each section, and we'll take you apart. And that's what they did. And the problem is we've still got that position now. And
Matthew, please, can you bring your remarks to
okay, one more point. Yeah. As I say, the key really is to say, right, can the rail workers break out of isolation? Is there going to be an actual strike by BT? Is there going to be a strike by Royal Mail? Now, all of these things actually, of course, hang on the union bureaucracy. Again, the CWU have already sold out Royal Mail in 2019. You know, I wouldn't trust them, you know, with an inch. And the key question is, how do we break out of this? At this point, is how to break out of isolation. Thanks.
Thank you. Right, I'm going to Jim. And then I'm going back to the Byrne brothers. And I think by that time, it'll be time to ask our two speakers, Steve and Roger, to wind up the meeting. Okay, so Jim, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ed. Others have talked very coherently about the trade unions, the struggles, the way forward. And I'm not going to repeat the points, excellent points that comrades have made. I want to raise a slightly more tangential question, which is just looking at the strategy and thoughts of the enemy of the capitalist class. And what I find very striking about this crisis is the lack of any coherent alternative posed by British capitalism. I think there's a real lack of confidence among the capitalist class at the moment. People have talked about the 1970s and the parallels there. But I think there's another parallel as well. We saw in the 1970s the implosion of the Keynesian model of capitalism. After 30 odd years of considerable success, it finally imploded. And the capitalist class then had an intellectual alternative in think tanks, leading politicians in this country, such as Keith Joseph, that they could restructure capitalism on a neoliberalist basis and smashing the trade union movement. And that's what came about. And that was accepted by New Labour. And of course, that came to a crashing close in the crash of 2008 that Roger referred to in his alternative. And I don't think really I've seen any strategic alternative posed by the capitalist class since. In Britain, the public were told that austerity was the answer, imposed, of course, and never forget, not just by the Tories, but by the Liberals as well. Then we were told that British capitalism would be liberated if we left the European Union and Brexit. Now I think all those have come crashing down and failed to resuscitate British capitalism. And as Roger said, it's become more and more the symbol of British capitalism of the empty tower blocks and so on, and hedge funds. There's nothing positive there. There's attacks on rights, increasingly shrill attacks on rights and push to the far right. But there's no positive PR alternative being put forward by British capitalism, which has been there in the past. And on the other side, on Labour, I mean, we always used to joke about Labour Party, it was reformism without reforms. Well, now it's just a policy-free area, really. It's a total vacuum. But of course, politics abhors any kind of vacuum. Labour is hoping that they can come back in just on the hatred of the Tories and Johnson, and probably the most corrupt British government in my lifetime. But I think they're going to struggle with that. The cost of living and stagflation now, and we're seeing the start of the fight back. I think in the next few months, as other comrades have made the point, we could see a major shift. It won't go in any straight line. It never does. There'll be ebbs and flows. And it has suggested, Roger mentioned in his lead up, that the probable course in Britain in the next couple of years is a Labour Liberal government. I think after a very possible short honeymoon, because people would be glad to see the back of the Tories, that would be racked by crisis because it has no policies to actually address the situation. And so we're seeing that in not just in Britain, but that instability in France, in the United States and so on. So my final point is that really instability is now the new norm.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you for being nice and concise with your time as well. Back to the Byrne brothers. Your hands up. Yeah,
Dominic.
Yeah, come in, please.
Yeah, it's just a few points. I think more should be made. You know, the fact that living standards are falling as far as workers are concerned, that there's a tax on conditions and all the rest of it. It's almost as if living standards are going to fall as part of the climate change or some act of God or something else. I think we've got to make far more emphasis on the fact that this is creating more and more billionaires, that the shift of wealth from the working class isn't evaporating, it's going into the pockets and the bank accounts of the ruling class. And their thing in the railway dispute, it seems to me that, you know, it's a question of modernisation. Modernisation for the capitalists at the moment is longer hours for the workers, harder work for the workers, less pay for the workers, less working conditions for the workers. And I think that's their, if you like, that's their programme as far as the working class is concerned. And now we're seeing within the railway workers and in other workers, the development of industrial action. And in lots of cases, I would imagine that's in the teeth of opposition from a lot of the trade union leaders, but they can't stand against the tide. And I think that's the situation that we're facing. And there's, to me, a certain sadness at the lack of the left within the unions. Well, as far as I'm concerned, I don't regret the fact that the CP are not controlling unions at the present time. I think what you've got is a raw, fresh youth and other workers developing. And it's a question of how we tap into that. Because I don't think looking over our shoulder about left unity of organisations in the past is good. Well, to my mind, it's a bit like trying to knit fog. I think you've got to take what's there. And what we've got to do is find mechanisms to get into the youth and the workers on the picket lines and elsewhere, and how you're going to develop them politically. And I think that's the real task that's facing Marxists at the present time, is how we get over the political message, you know, and if you like, what Marxism is all about. It's not some dogma, it's a scientific approach to life as it is. And I think that's what we've got to get over.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Dominic. Okay, now I'm coming back to Steve and Roger. Could I suggest you have about 5 minutes each to draw some conclusions from the discussion? And could I ask Steve to go first so that we can leave the last word with Roger? And then maybe there's a minute or two about what's going to happen for our next meeting. So, Steve.
Oh, thanks very much, Ed. I think it's been a very good and productive discussion. And I'd like to just sort of say a few words in relation to you know, what I started off with, and that is that we do face many problems and an uphill battle. And I think there still is a question mark, as comrades have rightly pointed out, as to whether this is the start of a generalised movement. I really like to hope, like to think that it is. I just want to pick up on a point that was just made about the bureaucracy inside the trade unions, and you know, the decline of the Communist Party and their influence in trade unions, because I'm a member of what was once the biggest union in the country. It's not now, Unite, and we've just had a General Secretary elected, Sharon Graham, and the right wing were deservedly and quite decisively rejected in the union, but also rejected in that election was the, how could you put it, I like to call it the faux left, and you know, you can spell that any way you like, but the old communist fellow travellers, if you like, and McCluskey's continuity candidate, who I mistakenly backed at the time. I think the membership, the active membership in Unite, was sick not only of the right wing, and would have none of that, they were sick of the faux left. And therefore they rejected it, and Sharon Graham was elected. Now I've got to say, you know, credit where it's due, up to date, they have had more strike ballots than they've ever had in Unite's history, and she's done quite sterling work. I only hope that that keeps up. But now I'd like to move from the second biggest union in the country, that was the biggest union, to what is the biggest union, Unison. And recently there has been one almighty struggle in that union, when the broad left around an organisation they call themselves Time for Real Change, actually stood a candidate in the General Secretary election who got the highest vote ever for a rank and file candidate, and had the faux left and the ultra left not split the vote, we, could well have won that election. But the candidate come a very creditable second. Almost immediately after that General Secretary election, there was the National Executive elections, and the Time for Real Change organisation actually won a majority. And what they have been trying to do in that union is to extend democracy, to extend support for workers in struggle, to turn it into a really membership-led union. But the old bureaucracy, that developed under Prentice and the former General Secretary, and has continued under Christine McAnair, were having none of it. And they moved heaven and earth to try and thwart Time for Real Change at every twist and turn. And at the conference of the biggest union in the country, and that's very, very significant, last week, by Christ, the right wing and the bureaucracy kicked the backside of the left Time for Change mob and defeated them utterly. It's a major setback for the left. Why? I think we can't brush these things under the carpet. Why did that happen? And if you examine it, like I have, you'll see that we apologised for things we hadn't done. We tried to appease, hold out the hand of friendship. All the mistakes that were made under the Corbyn leadership in the Labour Party. And I think the lesson that needs to be learned is that we need to be as strong and as decisive in forwarding the principles of socialism, the principles of the left, of collectivism, as firm and determined to do that as the bloody bureaucracy are to defend the status quo and their privileged position within it. There is possibly a mass movement developing. But I think if we're going to develop a new leadership, we've got to have a very determined leadership. And for God's sake, we've got to learn from these damn mistakes that the left seems to make again and again and again. So I just hope the comrades bear that in mind when they're getting stuck into their union work.
Thank you very much, Steve. Roger. Oh, Roger, you're muted.
Yes, okay. Well, comrades, it's been a really stimulating and worthwhile discussion. And I know that's something we always or often say, and it's always true. But I think particularly today, I really think it was absolutely a tremendous experience to participate in this discussion and to hear the contributions of comrades who've got, who embody between them decades of struggle in the working class, fighting for revolutionary ideas. I do think, this crisis that has come in Britain has been a long time coming, but it hasn't come out of the blue. It's come from varied, sharp, and absolutely earth-shattering experiences. The slump of 2008, the pandemic of 2020 onwards, the war in Ukraine, the developing climate crisis. And I think it's now we have to add to that the whiff in the air of revolution. And I do think it's not an exaggeration to say that the era of the revolution in Britain and worldwide has come. That doesn't mean that we're on the brink of revolution today, but I think it's an idea that is permeating the consciousness of huge numbers of people, and particularly among the youth. And I could tell any number of anecdotes of people that you talk to who are not even politically involved, and particularly young people of the younger generation, who will use that word spontaneously without prompting and say, don't you think we need a revolution? That's what we need. And I think that's the important thing. There's been a lot said today, and it's absolutely right about, unfortunately, we see in this meeting again, of course, the experience we have here, but not a great deal of youth. And I think I'm not worried about that, because it's true that young people are not involved politically now. But I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever that in the very, very near future, they will become involved. One thing we talk about, youth, they don't have the experience, they didn't have the, learn from the struggles of the past, the defeats of the past, and all the rest of it. But one thing about youth is they learn very, very, very fast. That's something well, particularly when they get good teachers, and I hope that we're good teachers, and the youth, I think, are drawing conclusions at lightning speed. Now, this question, obviously, the struggles that are coming are only the beginning. They are industrial struggles. They're struggles which are on immediate issues facing the working class and facing the entire population. But they are also political, and the political repercussions will not be lost on the participants. They are not lost on the participants. We know that, and we can see that. And I think, I haven't focused on the question of the political implications, particularly on what's happening with the Labour Party and so on. But I do think it's necessary to say, of course, the whole situation demands a new party of the working class. It demands a new mobilization of politically of the working class for socialism. But that is coming. That is implicit in the situation. Again, what we've had is a temporary breakdown and temporary confusion, which I know could have been avoided. We did have, remember, hundreds of thousands of people did swarm into the Labour Party in order to support what they saw as the way out politically to a socialist solution. But they're temporarily disorientated. I wouldn't say demoralized, disoriented. They don't know where to go and so on. And there are, as comrades said, there is no shortage of little left parties and little left groups which are doing sterling work and are winning people in ones and twos and in small groups and so on. But to create a mass new party, it's going to take more than that. It's going to take a movement which will arise from these trade union struggles, which, after all, involve hundreds or tens of thousands, and at least when it comes to it, hundreds of thousands of people involved directly on picket lines and in struggles and on strikes and so on. And therefore, the way that a new mass party is going to be created, it won't be from charismatic individuals. It won't be from the excellent work being done by this and that and the other little groups that exist now. It'll come organically from the movement itself. Comrades have talked about, I do think Newham is a little bit of a prototype, because in Newham, the bureaucracy of the Labour Party shut down the two constituency Labour parties, and as a result, the activists came together and formed Newham Socialist Labour. And as comrades have said, we've made an impact. We're out on the streets, we're leafleting, we're campaigning. We put candidates for the local council, candidates for mayor, and so on, and made some impact. I'm not exaggerating. We're not a mass party, but it's been beginning to make our voice heard, and that's the way in which things will go organically out of the movement itself. But overall, no charismatic individual has been able to create a party out of thin air. We've had Galloway tried, we had Scargill tried, we had the ILP in the past, we had the Socialist Party, which became Tusk, or in effect, we had the SWP and so on, and all done, good work in one way or another. But it hasn't made the impact of creating a mass revolutionary party. But what will happen is this movement in the class, this movement in the trade unions will generate something. You say, people say, well, how can we break through the the two-party system in Britain and so on. Well, the Labour Party, when it originated, they broke through the two-party system. They smashed the Tory liberal duopoly of political power, and a new workers' party revived and infused with the revolutionary spirit, or at least the radicalized spirit that we're seeing of young workers entering into struggle now. That will create the conditions, which won't be immediately a revolutionary party, but it'll be a ferment of ideas which will allow at least a revolutionary tendency to coalesce and to take shape and create the means by which the revolution can be carried through. There's been, as we've said in WIN meetings, and that is the purpose of WIN, by the way, education, learning from the struggles of workers around the world. And by the way, it's good to see at this meeting, I think there's comrades from 7 countries are participating in this meeting today, and the same is true of all our meetings. We have our weekly WIN meetings where we examine, we really put the spotlights, we really focus on the struggles that are taking place in this country and that country, or the struggles of the past from this era or another, and really learning the lessons and generalizing the lessons from them. But we've talked in our meetings, in our WIN meetings, of the worldwide uprising which is taking place, which has swept through Latin America, it's swept through Africa, it's swept through many countries in Asia, it's made its mark in some countries in Europe too, and it's now reaching the shores of Britain too. The worldwide uprising has reached Britain, and things can't change. Things can't go back to what they were. We're at the beginning of a new era now. There's a lot of points I would have liked to have taken up, but because obviously there's not time to do that, and I don't think it's necessary. I think we've all learned enormously, as we always do at WIN meetings, from the contributions of every participant. So thank you, comrades.
Right, thank you very much, Roger. And thank you, Steve, as well, and all the comrades who've contributed. I think it's been a brilliant discussion. I was actually interested to see that when Roger said there's not young people at this meeting, that Ian switched on his camera just for a mo so that we could see he's at least half the age of the rest of us. And there's somebody down whose picture on my screen appears down the bottom as well, called Michelle, who if that's a picture of her, she doesn't look like she's as old as me anyway. So
really.
Welcome those of you who are a little bit younger to this meeting, and we hope you come again. Now, I think there's probably time for 1 or 2 words from Roger about what our plans are for next week, and then we'll close the meeting. Roger.
Right, next week our French comrades will be speaking about the significance of the political earthquake that took place last week in France, with the sign of the instant destabilization of the Macron presidency, the huge strides forward made by the left, and unfortunately also the huge threat posed by the right, by the far right under Marine Le Pen. So I think that's going to be another really crucial meeting, and I hope as many comrades as possible will participate.
Thank you very much, Roger. Okay, thanks again, everyone, for your contributions, your involvement in the meeting. Look forward to seeing you next Sunday, if not some other time before then. And if you're going on the picket line, best of luck. Bye.
Bye, comrades.